All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Caileen, and I'm sitting here with Megan. Megan's the more important one. Go ahead and get in the camera here, Megan. I mean, I guess I'm somewhat important, but not really. So we're here to discuss the natural winemaking process. Megan is rad. This is actually the first time I've ever met her in person, and I'm super duper stoked. But we have a lot to cover today. So first things first, who are you, Megan? Where are you from? How long have you been in wine?
Hello, everyone. I am Megan Bell. I own Margins Wine, and I am the winemaker and sole employee of Margins Wine. I am from the Bay Area, the East Bay, Livermore Valley. It's also a wine growing region, but my family is not in the wine industry at all. And I have been working in wine for my entire career.
Your entire career has been in wine?
Yes.
That's awesome, dude.
Went to UC Davis right out of college, right out of high school, right after I turned 18, and did the viticulture and enology program.
Cool.
Graduated in 2012 and worked around the world and have been in Santa Cruz the last 3.5 years.
Awesome. Hey, Jackie. So we do want to remember that this is a live Q&A session, and we do encourage you to ask any and all questions. So we have like every piece of technology you could possibly have up, and we can take notes and save all of your questions and address them as we go through this live Q&A. So fundamental basis, and this is actually a very complicated question, and I'm sorry to kind of throw Megan under the bus, but I did let her know this question was coming. Can you define natural wine?
Well, we were just talking about this a little bit beforehand, and this is a very contentious subject. I believe that you can indeed define natural wine, but a lot of people disagree on the actual definition because there's no legal definition. So you'll never see like a wine bottle that says natural wine on it or anything,
right?
At least at this point. To me, natural wine is at the most basic element, wine made from organic or biodynamic plus grapes.
So your grapes do have to be organic at least to be a natural wine?
Yes, but not certified. But in my opinion.
Right, because it's unregulated right now.
Yes.
Right. We're going to talk about that quite a bit today. This is why a natural wine, and sometimes if we slip and call it natty wine, that's what people call natural wine. Forgive us. Sorry. Someone just asked, does wine that has more tannin make it less expensive?
I would say no.
Yeah. That's actually a really good question, because tannin is a word that a lot of people throw around when they want to sound fancy, or they want to say like my wine is robust. It's very high in tannin, because sometimes you can correlate tannin composition with ageability. I don't know if you would agree to that, Megan.
Yes, I would agree.
Okay. And so sometimes people are like, you can age this wine for 20 years. Therefore, it's expensive. Therefore, it has higher tannins. And that might be what you're kind of correlating that to.
But you asked if it makes it less expensive, which is interesting, because I would say most people would say when they're like bragging about their super tannic wines that that's a reason to make it more expensive, which it's not.
Yeah. So that whoever led you to believe that logic, it's actually almost flipped, which is kind of funny. Hey, Christian. Hey, Amy. Hey, Johnny. I just saw a couple people join that I familiar faces for the evenings of Enology. When did you start making natural wines, Megan?
I would say the first time I had exposure to what natural wine was in 2013 when I was working up in Oregon.
Where were you working in Oregon?
At a place called Beau Frere.
I haven't heard of that.
They aren't necessarily natural wine, but they do farm their vineyards biodynamically, and I worked as their biodynamics coordinator in the vineyard for the summer and then worked harvest there.
What does a biodynamics coordinator do?
Make all the preparations, like with the dynamizer.
What is dynamizer?
It is the thing that you put the biodynamic preparations into that mixes it a certain amount of stirs each way to dynamize it.
Yeah,
before you spray it.
Yeah, so if you remember, if you were tuning in last week to Ken's episode, he talked a little bit about biodynamic farming and the things and the preparations that you do. So I guess that was kind of what you organized.
Yeah, exactly. And then I sprayed them all off of an ATV sprayer. That was my job there.
Crazy.
But I already knew that I wanted to do that. after I worked my first internship in Napa at a very conventional winery, and it didn't fit my philosophy at all. And I remember my parents asking me after a 6-month internship, "Do you know how to make wine now?" And I was like, "No, I have like no idea what I just did."
I know. I love when people are like, "Caileen, are you gonna make wine?" And I'm like, with all my winemaking experience, no. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
So we briefly touched on this, but right now there are no regulations on the natural wine community. So do you expect there to be regulations on the natural winemaking community in the near-ish future?
I suspect yes.
Okay.
I don't know for sure, of course, but there's so much excitement and press around natural wine right now that I can't see how we're not heading in a direction where that term is going to be regulated.
Yeah,
I would personally let it say unregulated because I think it's part of what makes natural wine cool.
Oh,
but maybe a lot of the people that are gung-ho 100% natural wine people would want a regulation so that they feel like they can distinguish themselves. But I think regulations tend to put us in a box rather than make us
that's actually a really interesting perspective. I would think almost the opposite. Like I would think that regulation would provide you more opportunities to make it easier to sell your product, to get it out to more people.
Mm-hmm.
So Christian asked, is there a lot of genuine competition between wine regions and producing countries, or does everyone in the industry get along quite well? I'm even going to backtrack that a little bit, because between countries and wine regions is a really big thing, but maybe like within a region could be an easier question to talk about.
Yeah. I would say it highly depends on where you are and like what the philosophy of that place is, because I've worked in certain areas where, for example, Napa, I've only worked at one place there, so I'm not like a Napa expert or anything, and it was a long time ago, but there was absolutely no information shared between any of the wineries, and if you happen to mention something to another intern, you would like risk getting in trouble.
Oh, really?
From sharing the secrets of your winery or whatever, which has never sat well with me because I don't like those types of secrets. And I think anything that involves things that people will eat or drink shouldn't have any secrets, and that we should just tell people exactly what we're doing.
Yeah.
But then I've worked in other areas where everyone is the best of friends, and there's so many harvest parties, and there's a beautiful community, and it just really has depended on where I am in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, I don't want to get too off topic because this is a very niche thing I'm going to answer right now, but within the Santa Cruz Mountains, which is where we are at and where I make wine, Megan doesn't make wine in like Santa Cruz proper. But do you source fruit from the Santa Cruz Mountains? Sometimes. Okay. So within this little niche community, it is very much so a community. And so I think that's different for every region that you're in, just like Megan said. How does, if we're going to the roots, and this is kind of one of the big fundamental differences, if you remember from what I posted in the stories to promote this episode, I think of winemaking in tiers where you have high intervention wines, you have conventional wines, low intervention wines, and then natural wines. And I think one of the big differences between even low intervention and natural wines is the fermentation process itself. So can you explain, Megan, how a natural wine fermentation might differ from what I'm going to call an inoculated wine fermentation or a conventional wine fermentation?
Sure. So just to preface, I call myself low intervention wine, but I would be way on the natural side of low intervention wine. The reason I call myself that and not natural is because I add a little bit of sulfur at bottling, and people who are hardcore natural wine, I believe, add nothing, no sulfur at any time. So with low intervention wine or natural winemaking, you're 100% native fermentation, which means you're not touching it at all. You're not adding any nutrients or any commercial yeast, and you're just leaving it to do its thing. Like maybe you have some temperature control going, and of course you're agitating it with, movement or whatever, but you are just using the yeast that was on the grape skins from the vineyard or that's on the equipment in the winery to start the fermentation. Versus in conventional or high intervention winemaking, you buy commercial yeast that you already have at the winery that's like dehydrated, and then you rehydrate it in the perfect environment with the perfect temperature, and then you throw in some nutrients and you have the yeast to get every single thing that it wants.
Yep.
And you're also theoretically getting everything that you want because you've chosen a yeast that will provide certain aromatic characteristics or eventually certain characteristics of mouthfeel in the wine. So you maybe have more control.
Someone just asked, I think, one of our favorite questions, which we'll get to in a second, because we love this question, which is, why would you add sulfur? We love sulfur. I love sulfur. Before we talk about sulfur, let's talk about what we're drinking, Megan, because this is one of your wines. So we're drinking Margins. This is the 2017 Chenin. Where's this fruit from?
This is from Clarksburg. Clarksburg is on the Sacramento River, about 10 miles south of Sacramento. It is in the Central Valley, but it's a pretty cool region because of a huge diurnal swing. So if it's like 90 degrees during the day, it's going to be 50 degrees at night because of the winds coming off of the delta.
Oh, is this a low intervention or a natural wine?
This particular one, I would say, is low intervention. This is from an organic vineyard. There is nothing taken away, we'll say, so it's not fined or filtered. Filtration is exactly what you guys think. It's, running it through like a membrane filter to get out certain particles or yeast or bacteria, and then fining is adding certain charge of protein to attract the opposite charge to clarify the wine.
If you remember from Barry Jackson's interview, we talked about bentonite. So bentonite was used in the champagne making process, and that is a negatively charged particle that attracts positively charged proteins because the pH of wine is so low that most proteins are positively charged. That's an example of fining like Megan is talking about.
So this wine has none of that, and the only thing that is done to this wine is that once it's done being in barrel for 6 months and it's racked, and anytime we move wine around, we just call it racking. So once it's racked into a tank from the barrels that it's been sitting in, right before bottling, about a week before, it gets some sulfur dioxide, which acts as a preservative.
Yeah, we'll talk about sulfur after we answer Kyle's question. And he asked, do the different methods make different alcohol contents? So does a natural winemaking process versus a conventional wine process end in a different final ABV?
Not necessarily, but often yes, which is because most natural winemakers tend to pick their grapes at lower sugar. So they're ultimately getting a lower alcohol.
Why would they pick at lower sugar?
They pick at lower sugar because, well, I think this is the biggest reason, because then the grapes have a lower pH, higher acidity. And when you're doing natural winemaking, you don't have as many methods of preservation available to you. So the best you can do is use something that occurs naturally, like pH.
Yeah. So why would you add sulfur?
So just to clarify, we don't add elemental sulfur. We do use elemental sulfur in a vineyard to like keep away mildew. But in the wine, when we say sulfur, we mean sulfur dioxide.
Mm-hmm.
And that acts as a preservative and also as an antioxidant.
Yep, exactly. So sulfur, and we're talking pretty low numbers here. So I don't know what, are you like 10 to 20 ppm probably?
I add 20 parts per million.
Okay.
Always. And then I end up with a number between 6 and 16.
Okay.
As total sulfur.
Yeah. So those are really, really low SO2 values. So, yeah, I don't want to talk about sulfur. We have a whole podcast on sulfur. It's awesome. So sorry, my phone is actually in the way of some of my questions. That was really poor planning, Caileen. Does the microbiological profile of a natural wine during the fermentation process differ from a conventional wine? And this is yeast and bacteria included. I
would say yes, but not necessarily also. Mostly at the beginning, because with natural wine, when the grapes first come in and they're not fermenting, you have a bunch of wild yeast that are going to be more active at that temperature range and low alcohol or no alcohol range than Saccharomyces, which is the yeast that primarily ferments like wine and beer does.
Hey, Mama.
That yeast is really alcohol tolerant, and it amongst other things, but it hold on. What am I talking about?
So
okay, so at the beginning,
microbiological
with
profile.
a natural wine, you're gonna have a bunch of super active wild yeast that have outcompeted Saccharomyces. With a conventional
Do you know what some of those yeasts are?
We have like Pichia, Clecera, Decera, which is like Brettanomyces, Schizosaccharomyces. Those would be like some of the most common ones.
What about bacteria that are present at the beginning of a natural fermentation?
We have a lot of like acetic acid bacteria, and
it's like
acetobacter for sure. And then we deal with lactic acid bacteria like Pedococcus, Enococcus. Those would be the most common.
Yeah.
There. And for a conventional wine, once you add that Saccharomyces, that is just going to totally take over the fermentation, and all of those wild yeast are going to be outcompeted right away, which is why a lot of people will say that natural wine has a more complex profile, because it's partially fermented by wild yeast, at least until the fermentation hits a point of alcohol where those all can't survive anymore.
Yeah, so some of the cool complexities in natural wine, and this is what makes it so exciting and also so challenging, is that the beginning part of that fermentation is slower. I don't want to say significantly slower, but it's slower than what we call like a pitched inoculation, or when you just throw a sack at it. And so you have time to develop these flavors that come from bacteria or non-Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast, which can give you a much more diverse profile in aromatics. Because if you go into a vineyard and you pick a grape and you taste it, it doesn't taste like the final wine at all. So most of the flavors that you get in wine come from the actual fermentation process. So if you have more things giving rise to fermentation, you're going to have a more broad profile of aromatics, which is rad. Huge fan. And like this. Sorry, I can't get past we have our friend Alyssa's actually over here. She's working right now, but she was with us earlier and she was smelling it and she was just like, what'd you say, rubber band, Alyssa?
No, that's the other wine.
Oh, it's the other wine?
Yeah. This one's like yeasty apple and like super delicious.
Yeasty apple and super delicious.
Yeasty apple and super delicious. Totally.
Sounds good, but
yeah. Yeah. Oh, please ask any questions. So not only are Megan and I sitting here, we also have our friend Alyssa over there, who's another friggin' female wizard in wine. So feel free to ask any and all questions, but I'm going to keep going through our interview. So, what attributes of wine make it amenable to natural preservation and storage?
So we can go back to the tannin question from the beginning. High tannins make it amenable to natural preservation and storage, and then high acidity, so low pH. A lot of the bacteria or off yeasts that grow in wine are less active at lower pH. So a lot of us that do natural wine, that's another reason why we try to pick early, because if grapes come in at pH 4, for example, we're going to have a lot that's really high. So most grapes come in between 3 and 4, and will go up by about 0.2 if it completes malolactic fermentation or not. So I myself I'm not super into tannic wine varietals. Sometimes I like them when other people make them, but that's not the type of wine that I'm going for. So picking at low pH is really important to me.
Yeah.
Besides those two things, natural wine has a hard time preserving, which I think we're going to talk about in a minute.
We are going to talk about, although I'm actually kind of curious. We've talked about it a little bit on this show before, but I want to know what you think the pH of a final wine is. You can just start spitting out numbers. And I don't want to give the answer away just yet, but I do want to talk about how pH changes as a function of fermentation, because I think it's super fucking cool. So you have acids in wine that are going to be converted into other things. So when the grapes come into you, their starting pH is actually going to be lower than their final pH. So everyone says that wine is super acidic, and it is, but you have things like malic acid that are going to get converted to other things and change the pH. And so it's really important for a winemaker to be really particular with the pH that they pick their grapes at, because it's going to rise as a function of fermentation. So those are some of the things that can make wine in general ageable and can kind of like up the potential of long-term storage, which is why natural wine can even be a thing. But how might you categorize the chemical composition of a natural wine as opposed to a conventional wine? So how might the profile of a conventional wine be different from a natty wine, a natural wine?
This is as we said at the beginning, this is a hard question because people get mad when you talk about stuff like this, because
people do get pissed.
Because when we talk about it, it might the words that we might use to describe it will sound like stereotypically negative, but they aren't necessarily. Natural wine often has higher volatile acidity, so that would be either like a vinegar characteristic or like an ethyl acetate characteristic, so like nail polish remover-ish smell.
What does volatile acidity come from? And why is it more pertinent in natty wines than conventional wines?
Well, it certainly comes from acetic acid bacteria that are more active at the beginning because they're free to roam, because they're not immediately killed with sulfur. Because with natural wine, we don't add a bunch of sulfur dioxide as soon as the fruit comes in the way that we would. I've worked at lots of conventional wineries, and the grapes are coming in, we're processing them, and we're just throwing in sulfur even before the fermentation has started to knock all those things back, because Saccharomyces are also very sulfur dioxide resistant. So they're one of the only things that can thrive even at a high sulfur level.
Yeah. If you remembered back to what Megan was just saying earlier, because that initial fermentation is a lot slower for natural wines than conventional wines, it allows non-sac species and bacteria to thrive. Acetobacter being one of those bacteria. They create acetic acid, acetobacter, and acetic acid gives rise to what people in wine call volatile acidity. So that's one of the different chemical characteristics of a natty wine versus a conventional wine. Are there other things that people might expect to be different from a natty wine versus a conventional wine?
Yeah, let's talk about a stereotypically good thing. There's lots of like quote unquote bad things we can talk about, but one of them is like the juiciness. We'll say like the juice factor.
I like this already.
A lot of natural wine, when you're drinking it, even though it's wine, it still tastes like juice, and people will drink it and say, "Oh, it's so juicy." Versus, like, I don't think I've ever felt that way about a conventionally made wine. Like, it tastes like wine, and it's done like that for a reason. It's like super finessed, and it's usually filtered, and the alcohol is higher, and it's like a deeper, darker color, and it's clear. Versus a natural wine, lots of my wines, even low intervention wines that aren't filtered, they are cloudy. They're purposefully cloudy. And
can I even see this? Probably a little bit, yeah. So this is one of Megan's wines. This is her Chenin Blanc from Clarksburg, and it is a little bit cloudy compared to a wine that's been finer filtered.
Yeah, and they're alive. Like, I don't know about this wine, but at least some of my wines, if you look at it under a microscope, they would move. So that is certainly different.
That's super cool, actually.
If you look at, something from a bottom shelf at a grocery store, we'll say like the ultimate conventional wine, you might see some dead yeast cells, but maybe, like, probably not.
Probably not. They probably filtered it out with like a 0.45 micron filter.
Yeah, but so that's the best you could do, but nothing else would be alive. So in that juiciness, to me, that's like a lot of the freshness and a lot of the reason that a lot of people think natural wine isn't meant to age, which it doesn't necessarily mean it's not meant to age, but it's just so good right away because it has that freshness because it really is just juice that's been fermented versus juice that's been fermented and then had all these other things done to it.
Yeah, like almost taken away from it, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I know I say this all the time, but please feel free to ask any and all questions. Like, this is the zone of no judgment. We are drinking wine. We hope that if you were in a time zone where you can drink wine right now, you're also drinking wine with us. And we'll try to answer any and all questions. So just like keep them coming. This is rad. Are there any other things that you want to point out that might be different from a chemosensory perspective on a natty wine versus a conventional wine?
To me, a lot of it is like also like drinkability. A lot of conventionally made wines are made to age. And it's funny because a lot of people say like, natural wine is made to drink right away and like conventional wine is meant to age. I think all wines can be made either way, but the conventional wine isn't necessarily made to age. It's just that the processes they use make it so that it is not good right away. And that is a nice excuse to be like, oh, the tannins just need to get silky,
You're like, and what I mean by that is I just abuse the hell out of it, and you actually shouldn't touch it for like a year. So it can like calm down from its stressful moment.
Yeah, so to me, they're certainly better right away, which is honestly, like, at least in the United States, that is how people drink wine. So
yeah,
that people here most people, they don't lay their wines down for more than, I don't know, like a week.
Yeah, actually, we may have some people who are not US based. And if you're not US based, I'd be curious to know, if you consider yourself a wine drinker, do you buy wine to drink it now or to lay it down? I do both.
Mm-hmm.
I love finding a killer $20 bottle that I can drink on a Tuesday. That's rad. That's the best. And I probably only have, I would say honestly, probably 5% of my entire wine stock is ageable as far as like long-term storage.
Yeah.
So this actually segues into the next question that we have in the interview is, and this is a very complicated question, and Megan was almost like, I don't even want to answer it. This is too hard. How does the ageability of a natural wine differ from that of a conventional wine? Bum, bum, bum.
So a lot of this is regionally dependent also. Like, say we're in a region in California that mostly makes Cabernet. Of course, Cabernet being a varietal that's so high in tannins and typically picked pretty late, high in alcohol, a wine like that is going to need to age for it to be good, just because that's the grape.
Yeah.
Versus like here we are in the Santa Cruz Mountains, mostly growing Pinot Noir. Those Pinots might be better after 4 years, but Pinot is notoriously low in tannins and high in acid, and it's usually pretty good right out of the gates.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like more of a regionally dependent question. Besides, like the only like real answer here is like worst case scenario with the natural wine, say like it's just full of VA. So just to review, like full of like it's almost vinegar,
volatile acidity,
that
acetic acid
obviously isn't gonna age very well because it's just gonna increase when you get oxygen permeation like through the cork over time.
Yeah. So I have a question, and maybe you sort of just answered it, and this is not in our script, and I'm kind of throwing Megan under the bus right now. But if you have a natural wine that didn't have SO2 added at bottling, so remembering that sulfur dioxide, SO2, is a thing that is an antioxidant in wine, how does that not affect the ageability of a natural wine versus a conventional wine? Like, you would think that if, let's actually talk about low intervention wines versus natty wines. So let's say they're made the exact same way. They were both native yeast fermentation, but at the end of that fermentation with my low intervention wine, I added 20 ppm SO2 or sulfur dioxide at bottling, and my natty wine, I didn't add any SO2 at bottling. Same varietal, same lot, same harvest date. Will they age the same?
They will not age the same. However, it's hard to say what's better. And the way that I know this is that in 2016, I made most of my this Chenin Blanc that we're drinking now, which is a 2017, but the year prior, most of that wine got 20 parts of sulfur at bottling, and then 40 cases of it got no sulfur.
Did I seriously just like state an experiment that you actually did in real life?
Yes.
Fuck yeah.
And the reason that I did that was because I knew that I'd have a market for it, of course, but also because when do we ever get to try the exact same juice with just one variable?
What's the difference?
the difference was that right out of the gates, the sulfured wine was much better. But over a year later, the unsulfured wine
Really?
was highly preferred.
Shit. How
And
so?
it was better. It tasted better.
Like fresher or like what is better here?
What's better? I think that it was not oxidized at all.
The natty wine was not oxidized at all.
No.
I like how Susanna and Dan are like thinking of Natty Light, like like poor college beer decisions. Like,
it's better than that.
Yeah. My poor college decisions for beer were PBR, so I can't relate.
But like right away, I felt like the oxidation of the unsulfured wine, like right after bottling, was quite noticeable. And then after that year, once the sulfured wine had some time to age and was like maybe slightly more oxidized, that the unsulfured wine wasn't as noticeably oxidized. And I don't
so weird.
necessarily, I don't have a reason for that. I think that natural wine is full of
I have a hypothesis.
possibilities.
I have a hypothesis, and this could be very wrong. So, did you add any? Megan and I did not talk about this before this. Just FYI. Did you add any SO2 to any part of that winemaking process prior to bottling?
No.
So I'm wondering. So within SO2, this is why SO2 could be a whole podcast on its own or a whole episode on its own. You can have total SO2, and within that you have bound SO2 and free SO2. So SO2 or sulfur dioxide can bind to small molecules within a wine, like quinones, like alcohol, which is bad, not always bad, but it creates free radical species anyway. But it can also bind to like yeast particulates, or it can bind to like solids in wine. So I wonder if it was actually, again, this is a hypothesis that is unfortunately going to be on the internet for forever, but I wonder if that SO2 is actually just bound up by solid particulates in the wine, because there are more solid particulates in natural wine than in low intervention, or than in like conventional wines or filtered wines.
Yeah.
So it could just be that SO2 is bound up by solids.
Yeah.
You know, maybe. I don't know. I'm talking out my ass.
It certainly could be. And then we also, have the fact that fermentation creates SO2 naturally. So even that unsulfured wine would have some level of SO2 in it. And I don't know, maybe the time that was formed was later because it wasn't sulfured. Like there's really no way to know.
Yeah.
Because no one was studying that on a regular basis to test it.
What is the academic, do you know what the I guess academic interest right now is in natural wine? Is there, like, are people at UC Davis or Cal Poly or Bordeaux studying natural wine from an academic perspective?
I don't know.
Again, throwing Megan under the bus.
I haven't been
ahead of time.
I did go to Davis, but it's been 6 years.
Yeah, it's been a hot second.
And at the time, it wasn't.
At the time, it absolutely was not something that was being talked about, because I think even people here, we've only heard about this in the mainstream in the last year or 2 years max. So it just wasn't something yet.
Wave your hand if you knew what natty wine was before like a week ago. And natural wine. When did you hear about natural wine, Alyssa?
Well, I mean, it's been around for a long time. Like I was saying, like we used to buy that wine probably 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, people weren't really using that term, and they were just kind of talking about the way they farmed. Like that was the more important thing. And like if they didn't add sulfur, that was like something that was later. But like how they farmed was the most important thing.
Yeah. So you can't see, but our friend Alyssa, who's also another wine genius, is over here talking, and she made the good point that people were talking about natural wine, 5-10 years ago, but they're talking about it more from a farming perspective. Because as Megan noted, you need to have organic or biodynamic grapes to make a natural wine. So this is one of my favorite questions. Practically speaking, what are some of the challenges of natural winemaking?
There's so many.
Let me pour you some wine. You want some wine? Alyssa's like, I want wine too.
There's a lot to say on that.
You guys should really come and hang out with us for evenings of Enology. It's the best. I wish you could see. We just have this like 2 giant cheese boards full of like cheese and peaches and olives and bread and butter, and it's great.
In some ways, natural wine is much more challenging, and in some ways, it's so much easier than conventional wine. And actually, a lot of people will say that natural wine is lazy winemaking because there's so much less done, meaning we don't always like rack our wines during aging, meaning like once they've been barreled in the middle of the winter, then take the wine out, put it in a tank, clean out the barrels, and then return it. A lot of natural winemakers will just choose to leave their wine on the lees, so all the dead yeast and other solids that have collected in the barrel throughout the entire year to either add complexity or in some ways act as a preservative, depending on the type of style that you're trying to go for. So you're not doing as much work. And then we don't filter. Filtration, which I've done many, many times at different wineries that I've worked at, is a huge job. It's in fact my least favorite job because of how time consuming it is. And I don't choose to not filter because I hate it. I choose to not filter because I think the wine is better unfiltered. Right. That said, because we're not filtering, we have all these potential spoilage issues that conventional wines don't face because they're filtered at 0.45 microns, which gets out everything that you would possibly ever be worried about. So you don't need to worry about things changing in the bottle, versus natural wine, the wine might be one way when it comes out of barrel right before bottling, and then once it's in the bottle, who knows what it's going to be because it is still changing and it is still alive.
Can you explain how those living organisms might give rise to change in such a high alcohol and low pH environment? So because you're in a bottle, right? You're in a mostly anoxygenic environment. You're at a low pH and you're at a high alcohol. How is it that those bacteria and yeast can still create change, and how long are they able to make change in the bottle? Do you know? I've heard numbers anywhere from like 8 to 16 months. Like, you know?
Yeah, I don't look at my wines with that, like in a sciencey way. Like I'm not looking them under a microscope every certain month.
No, I'm just curious.
I definitely taste them at those different increments, which is easy.
Yeah. So this is always interesting to think about. I'm not wearing any rings. I forgot. Oh, yeah. If you're on my page, you saw that I was like deep in the vineyard yesterday and my rings were just trashed. So they're currently sitting in like a cleaning solution because I was an idiot. And Megan actually almost bought me gloves because she was like, girl, you need to be wearing gloves. If you're out there, you're a dumbass. But what does the time frame look like for a natural wine to go, let's say your Chenin, your 2017 Chenin, from harvest to wine's gone dry to racking to bottling? What does that time frame look like? If somebody were to say, I want to make, 5 gallons of natural wine in my house because now I know that I can do that. What's that time frame going to be like?
I mean, it depends on what wine you're making, and usually white or red wine. With this particular white wine, it's made in a very fresh, like early style. So this gets picked usually in August. This year, maybe September, which is crazy. And then it's in barrel for a little under 6 months and then bottled. And then I usually release it like a month later. So it's like a 7-month thing. It's real quick.
How long does it take to go from, I don't know if you press, I don't know. How long does it take to go from grape juice to dry wine? How long does that fermentation take? And how would that be different if you inoculated it?
Yeah, it really depends. That's a great question. It really depends on the outside weather, which is also what's cool about natural wine. Like I picked some grapes a week ago yesterday, and they've only fermented. They came in at about 23, and they're only
23 what?
Bricks. 23 bricks, you guys. The measurement of grape sugars, and 0 bricks would be dry. So they came in at 23, and yesterday they're at 18. So that it only went down 5 points in a week, which is crazy. So it's going to be a slow and low fermentation. Temperatures around 19 degrees Celsius. That's very cool for fermentation. Last year, during this particular week, it was 110 degrees in Santa Cruz, and we were fermenting dry in 2 days. Because the ferments
seriously?
were at 100 plus degrees. So it really just depends
biscuits.
on how hot it is. And myself, part of low intervention winemaking for me is that I don't use temperature control. So I'm not purposefully chilling my tank, the outside of my tank, not the inside, to keep it at a certain temperature and keep the fermentation slow. That is maybe desirable in some cases, but that is not what I believe in for low intervention winemaking.
Do you see a dramatic change in your flavor profiles of wines across vintages, like a wine that you produced before, if your fermentation was long and cold versus short and fast?
I would say no. I'm thinking of a vineyard specifically, not one of my wines, but one that I've worked with in the past. And some years was low and slow, and other years was the 2 days ferment. And I just find that more of the characteristics come from the vineyard and the site itself, or like terroir, if we want to throw that around right now.
Do you like the term terroir? This is also unscripted. This is also not on my actual list of interview questions.
I feel ambivalent toward it because I think that there's a lot to be said for how important it is the site is where grapes come from, but we can't ignore the fact that we're making the wine. And I think terroir is a good excuse for we have this great terroir, so then we decided to fine and filter and add tons of sulfur,
right?
Because it's just such a great piece of land.
I don't know. Yeah,
that's kind of ignoring the fact that you have so much human input in the winemaking process, whether or not you're natural winemaking or conventional.
Do you know Pete Tyrone, the associate winemaker at Booker?
No.
So we were a friend and I were talking, and we were kind of honestly bitching about the term like, wine is made in the vineyard. And we were like, no, grapes are made in the vineyard. Wine is made in a winery. Like, you can't ignore the fact that winemakers have a obviously very prominent role. So someone with a name that is not their name, it looks like, asked the question, are you concerned about the consistency of your flavors and profiles, or do you intentionally have different wines each season? How does that work for a brand? That's a really good question from a business perspective.
That's a great question. That's another reason that people will often say that natural winemakers are lazy, because we're not concerned with that question. And it's not because we're lazy. It's because the point of natural or low intervention winemaking is to make something that is like a time capsule of the year, basically. So I might change the way that I make the wine, like tweak it a little bit every year. But if I'm always working with that same site, there's already going to be so much difference every year just because of the temperatures mainly, and all the other things that happened in the vineyard that year: cover crop, bugs, animals, humidity, wind.
How might bugs or insects change your wine?
Well, in a worst case scenario, they'll just really mess up the vines. They can, disease the vines and end up killing them and change the way that water is transported in the wine the vine, and then that can change the composition of the grape itself. Yeah,
we'll be talking actually on Evening of Enology to an entomologist on September 14th. She's a PhD scientist who now is doing active infield entomology for not only Vitis vinifera, but for hops and a bunch of other crops as well. So that'll be kind of cool. We'll get to talk to her about that. And phylloxera, which is a whole nother can of worms. How does the environment with respect to winemaking change the process? And I'm guessing what you're asking here, and I'm sorry, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the environment, I'm assuming, where you're actually making wine. So how does that change from a conventional versus natural wine perspective?
Like the winery?
Yeah, so like the winery, the area that you're making wine. I'm assuming that's your question. Please correct me if I interpreted that incorrectly. Yes. So how does the actual area that you're making wine potentially change from a conventional wine versus a natural wine?
Well, the biggest one would be in a conventional wine, you are adding commercial yeast, the same one that you like to use no matter where you are. So that yeast is going to take over your fermentation, versus natural wine. This year I'm working in a new facility that I haven't worked in before, and I'm excited to see the differences in the fermentation, because every house or winery is going to have like a different yeast that's on most of its equipment, and it's probably still Saccharomyces, but it might be a slightly different strain.
There are like 8 or 10 strains of Saccharomyces, right? Even Saccharomyces cerevisiae, right? 8 or 10 strains, something like that.
I don't know how many, but
yeah, there's
definitely
more
than
than a handful.
one.
Yeah, there's a handful. And so I hate always, in the vast majority of cases, Saccharomyces, if a fermentation is left to just like do its jam, Saccharomyces cerevisiae is going to take over that fermentation. But within Saccharomyces cerevisiae, you can have multiple strains. And if Megan's working in a new winery now, and she's doing a natural fermentation as opposed to an inoculated or conventional fermentation, that strain might be different because she's in a new different place, right? Like, so that's actually a really, really good question.
Yeah, so that's part of it. And then the other part would be different wineries all have different equipment. So a lot of the winemaking has to do with logistics and what you even have available to you. So sometimes, depending on what tools you have, things change. For example, last winter, I didn't get to stir my barrels at all because the new facility I moved into didn't have a barrel stirrer, and like cost $300, and I just wasn't ready to pay that.
Oh wow! Oh,
so that certainly changed, and now I have procured one. But
I saw that on your Instagram. She took a picture of like her new barrel stirrer. It was pretty cute.
But yeah, a lot of it is logistical. Wine is a magical thing, but the industry purposely wants it to seem like smoke and mirrors, even though it's a pretty basic. Fermentation is, infinitely complicated if we're going to look at all the factors and everything, but at its basis, it's quite simple. And anyone can ferment things if you just know a couple of simple things.
If you want to learn how to ferment wines, you should follow Megan. She's good at it. So we don't have that much time left. If anybody has any questions, please fire them off right now and we'll answer them. But I want to close with, and this is again kind of controversial, but why do you believe in the natural winemaking process? Why do you think it's worth practicing?
Yeah. So wine is an agricultural product. It is not a luxury product. I think if you're making something that is agriculturally related and people are going to put it into their body, you don't do it with a bunch of chemical shit unless you're going to tell them. And people can make their own decisions if they want to do that. But for me, as someone who doesn't have a lot of money but still insists on buying like exclusively organic produce, and I see so many people, especially in the area that we're in, doing the same thing, yet those same people are buying bottom shelf Safeway or insert other grocery store here wines, and then only organic produce. That is fundamentally opposed. You cannot have the philosophy of buying organic produce and then buy conventional wine. And if you do, you need to re-examine it.
Megan just dropped.
It's wrong.
Megan just called a lot of people out on their bullshit, including me as well. Like, yeah, I've bought conventional wine on.
I mean, we've all bought.
When I was drinking wine, and originally I drank 2 buckchuck like probably every other person did when they started drinking wine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But once we have the means to do
that's a really good philosophy.
To do that.
Yeah. Howdy from Paris. I'm stoked that you're enjoying this topic. We also think that winemaking is very interesting, or else I guess you wouldn't be. I'm not a winemaker. Who am I kidding? I'm an enologist. I'm a chemist, and my topic is wine. It's pretty nice.
Besides that very extreme answer that I just gave.
Besides my very philosophically deep answer to your question.
The other reason for me is that I think it's more fun. Like when I'm drinking natural wines, when I first open them, they're one way, and an hour later they're totally different. Yeah. And that doesn't scare me. That makes me happy and excited that things are changing, and I don't want to get the same exact product every time. It's not a shampoo. It's like expecting the same exact tomato every time.
Yeah.
No one wants that. We want diversity in our produce, and wine is made of produce as well.
Yes. Yeah. Wine is just grapes. I would know. I dropped. Oh my god, I don't want. I dropped a lot of fruit this week. This is so awesome. Good. Hell yeah. Thanks for hanging out with us, dude. We really appreciate it. If people want to follow you or keep up with you, where can they find you, Megan?
I'm most active on Instagram at Margins Wine.
Websites, any of that stuff, Facebook, do you do that crap? Do you tweet? I don't tweet.
I definitely don't tweet. I do love my mailing list, people, which you can join on my on my website, marginswine.com. Perfect. And go to the tab that says mailing list.
And if people wanted to get your wine, could they get your wine?
They absolutely could. I sell my wine in my online store on my website, cool. And I ship to most states.
You do? Seriously?
Yes.
That's expensive. I just want you to know. It's very expensive to ship to states.
Yeah.
So if you have been... Oh, do you ship internationally?
I do not.
Okay. Right. But if you come to California, let us know and we'll hang out with you and we'll gladly drink wine with you. So next week we are going to be talking to our friend Abby, and she's an enologist as well, and we're gonna be talking about lab techniques that enologists do every week reliably. So as enologist, what do I do on a day-to-day basis? So Abby and I are going to break that down next week, and we will see you guys then. But for now, we hope you enjoy some wine like we are, and we hope you got to learn something tonight. So cheers, friends, and thanks for hanging out with us. We appreciate it. We'll see you next week. Bye. Cool. And then we end this stream. Too many screens up. This video is going to have we're going to have to edit this out. That's fine.